The morning I left my parents' old farmhouse for the last time, I remember the way the dew clung to the grass like tears refusing to fall. My shoes were soaked by the time I reached the gate, and yet the wetness on my face had nothing to do with the weather. I was 48 years old then, old enough to know that family can be cruel, and still naive enough to hope they might someday be kind. My name is Lorraine, though my relatives preferred to call me the Fool. The one who gave up her inheritance, her chance at a comfortable life, because she couldn't bear to fight over money. But what they never understood was that what I left behind that day wasn't just property. It was a graveyard of betrayal, and the ghosts in it still whispered my name. It began like most tragedies do with death. My father, Harold Whitmore, passed quietly in his sleep after 73 years of hard work, whiskey, and pride. He was a complicated man, harsh with his words but tender in his silence. I was his youngest daughter, the one who stayed behind when everyone else scattered to chase their own lives. My siblings, Judith and Peter, had long ago traded small-town life for city lights, returning only when it suited them. Christmas dinners, birthdays, the occasional guilt-driven visit. But I remained. I ran errands, tended the garden, paid the bills, and later, when my father's mind began to fade, I became his shadow, cooking, cleaning, and sometimes reminding him who I was. When he died, I told myself it was finally time to breathe again, that I'd done my duty and peace would follow. But peace doesn't come easily in families like mine. It began with a phone call 2 weeks after the funeral. Judith's voice, sharp and impatient as always, cut through the receiver. "We need to talk about the will, Lorraine. Don't drag your feet. You're not the only one grieving." That last part stung, because unlike her, I didn't have anyone to lean on. My husband had left years earlier after calling me too soft for letting my family walk all over me. He wasn't wrong. I just hated that he was the one to say it. The meeting took place in our father's old study. I remember the smell of cedar and tobacco, the faded sunlight slanting through the lace curtains, and the lawyer, a balding man named Mr. Haynes, shuffling papers with a deliberate calm. My siblings sat on either side of him, their expressions fixed in polite expectancy. I sat across, clutching the edge of my skirt. The silence was thick enough to drown in. When Mr. Haynes finally read the will, it was like listening to a ghost narrate the final scene of a play you never wanted to perform in. My father had divided the estate equally among us three: the land, the house, the remaining savings. But there was a catch. To access the money, we had to sell the property together. Judith's face lit up immediately, visions of cash dancing behind her painted smile. Peter, ever the opportunist, merely leaned back and said, "About time something paid off." Then all eyes turned to me, because they already knew what I would say. "I can't sell it," I whispered. "This house is—" "Sentimental," Judith interrupted, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Lorraine, you're living in a fantasy. This place is falling apart. You don't have the money to keep it running. Let's be practical for once." Peter nodded. "Dad's gone. You can't live in the past forever." Their words were daggers, but I stayed silent. Because what could I say? They weren't entirely wrong. The roof leaked, the paint was peeling, the taxes were overdue, and still, the thought of strangers walking through my father's study, stripping the walls bare, felt like a second death. So I told them to go ahead, to sell their shares. I'd figure something out for mine. That was the day they began to mock me openly. Judith laughed first, a sharp, brittle sound. "You? Buy us out? With what? Your non-existent job?" Peter joined in, his chuckle meaner than hers. "Face it, Lorraine. You're broke. You always were. I wish I could tell you I stood up and shouted, that I defended myself with the kind of righteous fury they deserved. But I didn't. I just sat there, listening, until the laughter died down and the only sound left was the ticking of our father's old clock. Steady, unrelenting, cruel in its own way. They left that night with smug smiles and full pockets of spite. Within weeks, they sold their shares to a buyer from the city, a real estate developer named Gerald Crane. I remember the name because it haunted me for months. He was polite, soft-spoken, and disturbingly charming, the kind of man who made you feel seen, even as he was taking something from you. When he came to visit the property, he looked around with admiration. "It's got character," he said, running a hand over the banister. "And stories." I didn't correct him. I just nodded and offered coffee. But that night, as I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the road, something inside me broke quietly. The kind of fracture that doesn't heal with time, only reshapes itself into something colder. Months passed. The letters came. Formal notices, proposals, offers. Mr. Crane wanted full ownership. My siblings urged me to sell. Judith even came down one weekend, her heels clicking across the warped wooden floor like a countdown to the end of everything. "You're holding us back," she said. "He's offering a fair deal." "Take it." But I didn't. Not because I was stubborn, but because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let go, I'd have nothing left. Not even the memory of my father's voice calling me his steady one. So I stayed. And the years crawled by like wounded animals. The town changed. New faces, new shops, the slow erasure of the world I'd known. I got by doing small jobs, bookkeeping, babysitting, even cleaning for neighbors too polite to call it charity. The laughter of my relatives still echoed in my head sometimes, especially on lonely nights. They sent occasional cards, not out of kindness, but to remind me they were doing well. Judith bought a condo in Boston. Peter invested in something big. They signed their names in gold ink, like royalty addressing a peasant. But the story doesn't end there, because fate, as I learned, has a taste for irony. 2 years after the sale, the new owner, Mr. Crane, stopped visiting. The property stayed untouched, its renovation permit stalled, its future uncertain. Rumors began to swirl that he died suddenly, leaving behind no immediate heirs. I didn't pay much attention. I'd learned not to expect miracles. Then one morning, a letter arrived addressed to me. Heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind that whispers wealth. Inside, a single page. "Ms. Whitmore, as the sole registered resident of the Whitmore property, you are requested to appear regarding the execution of Mr. Crane's estate." My heart stumbled. I reread it twice, my hands trembling. I had never imagined my name appearing in such a context. When I arrived at the lawyer's office a week later, I expected confusion, maybe a clerical error. But when I sat down, the man across from me smiled gently. "You were close to Mr. Crane, weren't you?" I blinked. I knew him, yes, but not well. He nodded. "Apparently it was enough. He left you the property, all of it." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt. "I don't understand," I whispered. "He admired your loyalty," the lawyer said. "He once told me you reminded him of his mother, someone who valued roots more than riches. He wanted the land in good hands." I left that office in stunned silence, the deed clutched to my chest like a lifeline. The same house my siblings mocked me for clinging to was now entirely mine. No conditions, no debts, no shared ownership. For the first time in years, I felt the air move differently in my lungs. Lighter, freer, almost sacred. Of course, the news spread fast. Within days, Judith called. "You're joking," she said. That property was supposed to be ours, too. It was, I replied quietly. And you sold it. Her silence was delicious. Peter showed up unannounced 2 days later, standing on the porch with a forced smile. You know, we were just looking out for you back then, he began, his eyes darting toward the windows. You couldn't handle the upkeep alone. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. And yet, here it stands. He shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about family and fairness. But fairness, I'd learned, was a luxury for the undeserving. They had their turn to laugh. Now it was my turn to live. Still, revenge wasn't as sweet as I imagined. It came quietly, almost gently. The satisfaction wasn't in gloating, but in silence, in the knowing that I had survived them all, that my dignity, once mocked, had outlasted their greed. Yet there was one secret left to uncover. One that would twist everything again. Weeks after I settled back into the house, I found an envelope hidden in my father's old desk drawer. The handwriting was unmistakable. His. My hand shook as I unfolded the yellowed paper. If you're reading this, my steady one, it means I've gone. I need you to know something. Crane isn't a stranger. He's your mother's son. From before she met me, the words blurred before my eyes. My father had known all along. The man who bought the property wasn't just some developer. He was my half-brother. I must have sat there for hours, the letter trembling between my fingers as the afternoon light dimmed across the old study walls. The silence pressed against me until it felt alive, breathing, whispering, waiting for me to fall apart. I had spent decades believing I was the dutiful daughter, the last keeper of our family's legacy, when in truth, I'd been living in the shadow of a secret none of us were meant to uncover. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had always carried sadness in her eyes. I used to think it was just exhaustion, years of farm life, of marriage to a man like my father, of bearing the weight of children and seasons that never seemed to give back what they took. But now I saw it differently. Maybe her silence was her confession. I read the letter again, slower this time. My father's words were shaky, written in a hand that had already begun to tremble from age. Your mother made a choice before you were born. She told me about him, about the boy she had when she was young and scared, before I ever knew her. I didn't judge her for it. I loved her more for her honesty. When I met Gerald years later, I knew who he was. I made sure he'd be taken care of if anything ever happened to me. And if he found you, Lorraine, I wanted you to treat him with the kindness your mother never got the chance to. I sat back, numb. My half-brother, the man who had bought our house, the man who had left it, and me, his only heir. The truth was like a wound reopening from the inside. All those years my siblings had mocked me. The universe had been quietly rearranging itself into a justice none of us saw coming. But justice never arrives cleanly. It always brings ghosts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like my mother's footsteps. Every flicker of light through the window seemed like her trying to reach me from the past. I remembered how she used to stand at the edge of the orchard, staring down the long road where the horizon met the sky, her hands wrapped around her apron. Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget, she once told me. I never understood what she meant until now. The next morning, I drove into town, the same path I'd taken for groceries, for errands, for every mundane necessity that kept me connected to the world. But this time, I wasn't the quiet woman keeping to herself. I was a daughter, carrying the weight of 2 buried lives. I stopped at the small graveyard by the church, the one where both my parents rested. Kneeling by their stones, I laid down a handful of wild daisies and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" The wind answered in the way only grief understands, by saying nothing at all. In the following weeks, I tried to piece the story together. The town librarian, Mrs. Abbott, had known my mother as a young woman. When I asked about her past, her eyes softened. "Your mother had a baby before she married your father." Poor thing had to give him up. Her parents insisted. She left town for a year and came back, quieter. I felt something break open in me. Pity, anger, confusion, all tangled into one. "Do you know what happened to the child?" I asked. Mrs. Abbott hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He was adopted by a couple from the next county, the Cranes. Fine people, though they died young. Gerald must have been that baby." It all made sense. My father had known, had kept the secret, and when Gerald grew up, fate brought him back here to buy the very land his mother once walked barefoot on. And in the cruelest, most poetic twist, he'd given it back to her daughter without ever revealing who he was. I went back home and sat on the porch for a long time, watching the fields shimmer under the late summer sun. For the first time in years, I didn't feel bitterness toward the laughter of my relatives. I felt something deeper, a strange, quiet forgiveness I didn't know I was capable of. They had mocked me for holding on to this house, but they didn't know what it held. They didn't know it was never just wood and walls. It was blood, history, and unfinished love. Of course, news travels fast in small towns, and my inheritance became the subject of gossip and envy. Judith called again, her tone clipped but careful. "I heard you got everything," she said. "Even the land." "I did," I replied simply. "That doesn't seem fair, does it?" I laughed softly. "No, it doesn't. But fairness left this family long ago." She went silent. I could almost hear her trying to calculate how to twist the situation into her advantage. Then she sighed. "You always were Dad's favorite." "No," I said quietly. I was just the one who stayed. After that, she didn't call again. Peter, however, couldn't let go so easily. A month later, he appeared on my doorstep again, this time in a suit far too expensive for someone pretending not to care. "Look," he said, lowering his voice like we were conspirators. "We were all young and stupid back then. Maybe we should start over. Family's all we've got, right?" I studied him. The slick hair, the restless eyes, the faint smell of whiskey. "You came here for money," I said. He forced a smile. "I came here to make peace." "Peace doesn't require signatures," I answered, and closed the door before he could respond. That night, I found myself in my father's study again, sitting beside the same desk that had once felt so heavy with loss. But now, it felt like a bridge between two worlds, the one I'd lived in and the one I was finally ready to understand. I took out the letter again and traced the faded ink with my finger. "You did right by him," I whispered, "and maybe he did right by me." It wasn't long after that when I received another letter, this time from Gerald's attorney. Enclosed was a photograph, old and sepia-toned. It showed a young woman holding a baby, standing under an oak tree. The woman was my mother. On the back of the photograph, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "For Lorraine, so you'll know. Love doesn't vanish. It only hides until it's safe to be seen." I cried until I couldn't anymore. For the mother who carried her secret like a scar. For the brother I never knew. For the father who forgave what the world might not have. Over the next year, I restored the house piece by piece, painted the walls, repaired the porch, cleared the garden of weeds until it bloomed again. Each nail I drove, each floorboard I polished, felt like stitching together generations that had been torn apart by shame and silence. When the renovations were finished, I hosted a gathering, not for my relatives, but for the townspeople who had watched from a distance all these years. The laughter that filled those rooms that evening was soft and kind, not cruel. As the sun set behind the orchard, I felt something inside me settle. I finally understood what inheritance truly meant. It wasn't about land or money. It was about the stories that survive us, the choices that echo long after we're gone. A week later, I received one last visit, Judith and Peter together. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, dressed too nicely for the occasion. "We wanted to see what you've done with the place," Judith said, her tone sugar-sweet and hollow. I led them through the rooms, letting their silence speak louder than their words. When we reached the study, Judith's eyes lingered on the photograph of our parents I'd placed on the desk. "You always were sentimental," she muttered. "Maybe," I said, "but sentiment is what keeps the truth alive." Peter tried to smile. "So, what happens now?" I looked at them both, the people who once laughed as I walked away empty-handed. Now, nothing happens. I live my life, and you live with what you did. They left without another word. I watched their car disappear down the same road that had taken my brother years ago. For the first time, the sight didn't sting. As I stood on the porch that night, the stars came out one by one, bright and unashamed. Somewhere in the orchard, the wind rustled through the apple trees, carrying the faint scent of blossoms and forgiveness, and I realized that the revenge I once thought I wanted wasn't vengeance at all. It was peace, but peace has a way of hiding the next storm just over the horizon. 2 months later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note that made my heart skip. "You don't know me, but I knew Gerald. He wasn't what you think he was. He left something unfinished, something that belongs to you." The words on that note pulled me into a silence so sharp it felt physical. He wasn't what you'd think he was. I sat in my kitchen that night, the envelope trembling in my hand, while the clock ticked toward midnight. The lamp threw soft shadows across the table, landing on the old photograph of my mother and the baby. For the first time since I'd inherited the house, I felt the weight of uncertainty return, heavier than ever. The next morning, I drove into town to find out who had sent it. The post office clerk, a kind man named Roger, looked at the envelope and frowned. "No postmark," he said. "Hand-delivered, I'd guess." "Someone local." I thanked him and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, my thoughts spinning. Whoever had written it knew where I lived, knew my connection to Gerald, and knew something I didn't. I couldn't decide whether to be frightened or curious, maybe both. That night, I found myself sitting in the study again, the same room where my father had written his final confession, where so many secrets had slept beneath layers of dust and silence. I read the letter once more, hoping some hidden clue might reveal itself. It didn't, but as my eyes wandered across the shelves, I noticed a gap in the line of books. One of the old ledgers that used to sit there was missing. I searched the drawers, the cabinets, even the small locked chest near the window. Nothing. But when I knelt to move an old rug, I heard a faint hollow sound beneath the floorboard. My heart quickened. I pried it open with a screwdriver, dust flying everywhere. Beneath it was a small metal box, rusted but intact. My father's handwriting marked the top. "For when the truth finds you." Inside, there were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Harold, my father, and signed G.C., Gerald Crane. I spent the whole night reading them, one by one. They spanned years. The earliest was from when Gerald first moved back to town. He wrote about buying the property quietly, about wanting to honor the woman he'd never met, our mother. He had known who I was all along. He'd watched me tend the house, pay the bills, care for our father until the end. He wrote, "I can't tell her. Not yet. She deserves peace before truth." The later letters grew darker. They mentioned someone pressuring him, a business partner named Alan Reese. Gerald wrote that Alan had helped him buy the property, but later wanted it developed into something ugly, a luxury resort that would destroy the land. When Gerald refused, Alan turned threatening. The final letter was short, hurried, and terrifying. "Lorraine, if this ever reaches you, I know you don't know who I really am, but you will. There's something hidden in the house that belongs to both of us. Keep it safe. Don't trust anyone from Reese Holdings. They'll come for it." My blood ran cold. keep it safe. What could it possibly be? For the next several days, I searched every inch of the house. Behind walls, under floorboards, inside the attic rafters. Then one afternoon, in the far corner of the attic, I found a small wooden trunk covered in dust. Inside were property deeds, photographs, and a sealed envelope marked, "Do not open until safe." The handwriting was Gerald's. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was another deed, one that transferred ownership of over 100 acres of undeveloped farmland surrounding the house. My name was listed as the inheritor. The date? 2 days before Gerald died. That evening, I drove to the town archives to learn more about Reese Holdings. What I found made my stomach twist. The company had filed multiple lawsuits over the years, accused of fraud, illegal development, and land theft. And Alan Reese, its founder, had died mysteriously in a car accident just months after Gerald. I went home shaken, unsure what to do next, but my decision was made for me 2 nights later. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the porch. My heart raced. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped quietly into the hallway, peering through the front window. A man stood at the gate, staring up at the house. He wore a hat low over his face and didn't move even when my light hit him. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Then, softly, he said, "You don't know what you're holding, Mrs. Whitmore." And just like that, he turned and disappeared into the dark. For a long time I stood frozen, listening to the silence swallow his words. The next morning, I drove straight to Sheriff Daniels. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "You say he mentioned what you're holding?" "Yes," I said. "And he called me Mrs. Whitmore, like he knew me." The sheriff sighed. "Sounds like someone's been digging into old land records. Happens all the time when there's property money involved. You should be careful, though." Careful. That was an understatement. For the next week, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me flinch. I started locking every door, every window. I even began keeping the letters in a safe at the bank, and yet, one morning, I found the front door ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing touched, except one thing. The photograph of my mother and baby was gone. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Something in me hardened, the same way it had the day my siblings laughed at me. Whoever was doing this wanted me to be scared, but I had lived through worse, so I began my own kind of revenge. I contacted a journalist named Claire Foster, a woman known for exposing corruption in small-town politics. I gave her everything. The letters, the deeds, the evidence of Gerald's final transfer. Within a month, she'd uncovered that Reese Holdings had been quietly trying to reclaim the property, forging papers that claimed Gerald's inheritance was invalid. The man who came to my porch was likely one of their agents. When the story broke in the local paper, it spread like wildfire. The headline read, "Hidden Heir Exposes Land Scheme After Developer's Death." Reporters camped at the gate. Judith called me an outrage, demanding to know why I'd gone public. "Because it's mine," I told her simply, "and because truth doesn't rot when exposed to light." I confined with a spirit. She had released, her voice shook. "You've ruined our family's reputation." I laughed bitterly. "No, Judith. You ruined it years ago when you sold your soul for money." The investigation that followed was swift. Reese Holdings collapsed under scrutiny, several executives arrested for fraud and bribery. My name appeared in newspapers as the woman who brought justice to a decades-old secret. People stopped calling me foolish. They started calling me brave. But bravery, I've learned, isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to stand your ground when every voice tells you to run. Months later, I was invited to a memorial fundraiser for Gerald, organized by townsfolk who'd admired him. They wanted me to speak. I nearly said no, but that night, standing before the crowd under the same oak tree from the old photograph, I felt him there, The brother I never got to meet. The man who somehow found his way back to us. I spoke simply. My brother didn't build an empire. He built something better. Truth. It took us years to find it, and even longer to understand it. But it's here now, rooted in this land, in this town, in all of us who choose kindness over greed. When I finished, the crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping, and soon the sound filled the air like rain. Afterward, an older woman approached me, her eyes bright with recognition. "You don't remember me," she said softly, "but I was your mother's friend. She'd be proud of you, Lorraine. You broke the curse." That night, as I walked home beneath a sky of trembling stars, I realized she was right. The curse wasn't the secret itself. It was the silence. And I had finally broken it. I thought that was the end of the story. But a week later, a small package arrived on my doorstep. Inside was the missing photograph, wrapped in linen. On the back, written in fresh ink, was a single line. "Now it's truly safe." I held that photograph as if it were alive. The handwriting on the back wasn't my mother's or Gerald's. It was unfamiliar, careful, deliberate. Someone wanted me to know the story was over, or at least that they were finished playing their part in it. I stared at the words for a long time. Now it's truly safe. Safe. That word had never belonged to this house, or to me. Safety had been something I served others, my father, my siblings, the ghosts of my family's mistakes. But as I stood there, in the warm hush of evening, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't protecting the house anymore. It was protecting me. I placed the photograph back on the mantel, next to the restored frame of my parents. My mother's soft eyes looked out over the living room, as if watching the world she'd tried to keep intact. The light outside shifted to gold, spilling across the floorboards, and the shadows of the trees danced along the walls. I took a deep breath and whispered, "It's done." But healing doesn't end with revelation. It lingers. It asks you to rebuild what truth has shattered. Over the following months, the house became a kind of refuge, not just for me, but for others who needed quiet. I started hosting small gatherings. Local women, single mothers, widows, anyone who carried a burden too heavy to speak aloud. We called it Sunday Circle, a simple name for something that became sacred. We'd sit in the parlor with tea, sometimes talking, sometimes just being together. The house that once echoed with arguments and mockery now hummed with gentleness. It was as if the walls themselves were learning how to forgive. One evening, as the fire crackled low, a young woman named Emily shared her story. She'd just lost her mother, a woman who'd raised her alone after being disowned for having a child out of wedlock. Emily's voice shook as she said, "I keep wondering if she ever forgave them." I reached for her hand. "Forgiveness isn't a gift we give others," I told her quietly. "It's something we finally allow ourselves to keep." That night, after everyone left, I sat in the study, looking at the letters Gerald had written to our father. The ink had faded, but the emotion hadn't. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way he wrote, as if he were always searching for connection, always trying to make sense of belonging. I realized we had been mirrors of each other without ever meeting. Both born into silence, both choosing kindness in a world that mistook it for weakness. The phone rang suddenly, breaking the spell. It was Judith. Her voice was thinner now, like age had finally caught up with the pride that once made her so sharp. "Lorraine," she began hesitantly. "Peter's gone." My breath caught. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Heart attack. Last night. They found him in his car outside the city." For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Despite everything, the thought of losing him hit harder than I expected. I closed my eyes and saw him as a boy again, messy-haired, laughing, chasing me through the orchard before life and greed carved him into someone else. "I'm sorry," I said softly. Judith sighed on the other end. "I thought you should know." "The funeral's next week," I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there." The day of the funeral was gray and heavy with rain, the kind of rain that soaks into the ground as if the earth itself is grieving. Judith looked smaller than I remembered. Her once perfect posture bowed, her elegance dimmed. We exchanged a quiet nod at the graveside. No hugs, no apologies, just a silent understanding that time had finally humbled us both. After the service, as people began to drift away, Judith stayed behind, staring at the headstone. "He never changed," she said finally. "Not really. Always thought money could fix everything. He died, owing more than he owned." I looked at her, surprised by the admission. "And you?" She hesitated, then gave a sad little laugh. "Maybe I changed too late." We stood there for a while, side by side, two women bound by blood and distance. Before she left, she turned to me. "I heard about what you've done with the house, the Sunday circle. People talk about it." "I'm glad they do," I said simply. Her eyes softened. "Mom would have been proud of you." It was the closest thing to forgiveness we'd ever share. That night, when I returned home, I lit a candle by the window and let it burn until dawn. I didn't know if it was for Peter, for my mother, or for all the ghosts that had finally found rest. Maybe it was for me. Weeks passed. Life settled again into a gentle rhythm. I tended the garden, hosted Sunday gatherings, and kept the letters in a wooden box by my bed. But one afternoon, while sorting through the attic, I came across something I'd missed before. A folded sheet of music tucked inside an old hymnal. The title read, "The Steady One." My father's handwriting filled the margins. "Full of rain, when words fall short." It wasn't a letter. It was a song. Simple chords, gentle melody. I played it on the old piano in the living room, and as the notes filled the air, I felt everything. The pain, the loss, the pride, the peace, blend into one long sigh of release. After that, I started writing again. Not for publication, not for recognition, just for myself. Stories of people like me. Women who had been underestimated, betrayed, or left behind, yet found strength not in revenge, but in resilience. The act of writing became prayer. The house, my sanctuary. One morning, a letter arrived from Claire, the journalist who had exposed the land scheme. "Your story has inspired people," she wrote. "A foundation wants to fund historical preservation on your land. In your name. They believe the house deserves to stand as a symbol of integrity and truth." I cried when I read it. Not because of pride, but because I finally understood the full circle of it all. The land that once tore my family apart was now uniting strangers under the idea that honesty still mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I walked to the edge of the orchard, the same spot where my mother used to stand. The trees were heavy with fruit, their branches bowing under the weight. I picked one apple, red and perfect, and whispered, "We did it, Mama. It's safe now." The breeze carried the scent of ripeness and memory. For a fleeting moment, I thought I felt her there beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I've learned that the hardest kind of revenge is the one that doesn't look like revenge at all. It's living well when they expected you to break. It's choosing peace in a world that thrives on bitterness. My relatives once laughed at me for walking away with nothing. But I didn't walk away. I walked toward something, toward truth, toward freedom, toward the kind of inheritance that doesn't fade with time or greed. Now when I look out at the land, I see more than property. I see a promise kept. From father to daughter, from brother to sister, from mother to child. A story buried in silence, resurrected in forgiveness.
If you've stayed with me this far, maybe you know what I mean when I say this. Sometimes the things we lose are the things that save us, and sometimes the people who mock us the loudest are just afraid of what we might become when we finally stop needing their approval. So this is my ending. Quiet, steady, and real. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it. Maybe it'll remind someone that no betrayal can bury truth forever. Leave a comment, tell me your thoughts, or share your own story, because every voice that rises from pain becomes part of the healing. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with me. There are more to tell.